The Haunting of Hill House, a true horror story. Nestled deep within a secluded forest stood the infamous Hill House. For over a century, the mansion had been the subject of whispered tales in the nearby town of Brentwood. Its once magnificent walls were now weathered and broken, yet still standing. The few who dared approach its ominous gates could feel an unnatural chill settle over them, as if the house itself was alive. The house had a dark past, shrouded in mystery. It was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy man named Richard Marston. Marston was said to have been obsessed with the occult, delving into forbidden rituals and ancient texts. After the sudden death of his wife, Eleanor, under suspicious circumstances, rumors began to circulate that she had been murdered, her soul trapped within the house's walls. In the years that followed, every family that tried to inhabit Hill House experienced unspeakable horrors. People reported strange sounds in the middle of the night, footsteps pacing in empty hallways, doors creaking open on their own, and faint whispers calling out their names. Even more terrifying were the sightings of a shadowy figure believed to be Eleanor's ghost, wandering through the darkened corridors. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in 1937, when the Johnson family moved into the house, determined to restore it. Within days, their daughter Emily began to talk about an invisible friend named Nell. At first, the parents dismissed this as a child's imagination, but soon after, Emily's behavior turned strange. She would sit alone in her room for hours, talking to herself, her voice sometimes eerily changing in tone, as though someone else was speaking through her. She began drawing disturbing images, black shadows, a woman's figure, and something that looked like an ancient symbol. One night, the parents woke to hear Emily screaming. When they rushed into her room, they found her trembling in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. She claimed that Nell had shown her things, terrifying visions of death and darkness. The Johnsons fled the house that very night, leaving behind most of their belongings. For decades after, Hill House stood abandoned, growing more decrepit with each passing year. It became a place for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators, but none stayed long. Every person who entered reported strange phenomena. Cold drafts swept through even on the warmest days, and the air inside felt thick, suffocating. Cameras malfunctioned, and unexplained shadows appeared in photographs. One particularly chilling account came from a group of ghost hunters in the 1980s. They had set up equipment throughout the house, determined to capture evidence of the supernatural. The night started uneventfully, but as the hours wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. In the early hours of the morning, they heard what sounded like soft crying echoing from the upstairs hallway. When they followed the sound, they found nothing but darkness. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and one of the team members felt an ice-cold hand grasp her shoulder. Turning around, she saw a faint figure, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face hidden in shadow. Terrified, the group fled, but one member, Mark, refused to leave without his camera. He ventured back inside alone. Minutes passed, then hours, with no sign of him. When his friends finally worked up the courage to return, they found his camera lying on the floor. Mark, however, was never seen again. His disappearance became one of the many unsolved mysteries associated with the cursed Hill House. As the legend grew, many questioned whether the haunting was real or just an exaggerated tale passed down through generations. But locals were convinced something evil lurked within those walls. Despite various efforts to demolish the mansion, Strange accidents always seemed to occur, construction workers falling ill, machinery breaking down, and even a fire that mysteriously extinguished itself before it could destroy the structure. To this day, Hill House stands as a monument to the unknown, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurs. Some say if you listen closely at night, you can still hear Eleanor's soft voice calling from the shadows, waiting for the next soul to claim. Hill House remains a place of unspeakable terror, a reminder that some stories are not just fiction. Some hauntings are real, and sometimes the past never truly dies. The Descent into Darkness. In 1995, a renowned paranormal researcher, Dr. Evelyn Clark, became fascinated with Hill House. She had spent her career studying haunted locations, debunking myths, and uncovering scientific explanations for supernatural phenomena. Despite the rumors surrounding Hill House, she was skeptical, believing the hauntings were merely the result of overactive imaginations and urban legends. Evelyn assembled a team of experts, a psychologist, a historian, and 2 experienced paranormal investigators. Their goal was to spend 1 full week inside Hill House, documenting every strange occurrence and uncovering the truth behind the house's sinister reputation. Equipped with state-of-the-art equipment, they entered the mansion with a mix of excitement and unease. From the moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere felt wrong. The house seemed to hum with a low, inaudible vibration that set everyone on edge. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive, as though the house was waiting for something to happen. But for the first 2 days, nothing unusual occurred. Evelyn and her team explored the house thoroughly, cataloging each room and artifact left behind by its previous inhabitants. They found old photographs, faded journals, and eerie paintings that depicted strange, dark landscapes. The historian, Dr. Alan Merrick, became particularly obsessed with a set of symbols carved into the walls of the basement, symbols that he believed were tied to ancient occult practices. On the 3rd night, things began to unravel. The team was sitting in the living room reviewing footage when the temperature dropped suddenly and the lights flickered. One of the investigators, Jason, noticed a shadow moving across the hallway. Despite no one being there, he rushed to grab his camera, but the shadow had vanished. Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, heavy, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. Determined to stay objective, Evelyn led the group upstairs to investigate. As they reached the 2nd-floor landing, they were met with an icy breeze, and the unmistakable sound of whispering drifted through the air. The whispers were faint, unintelligible, but they seemed to be coming from the direction of the master bedroom, the room where Eleanor Marston had died. Pushing through her growing fear, Evelyn opened the door to the bedroom. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and there was a distinct feeling of being watched. Jason set up his camera near the bed, but as soon as he turned it on, the equipment malfunctioned. Static filled the screen, and the lights in the room dimmed to an unnatural level. Suddenly, Dr. Merrick, who had been standing near the window, gasped. His face went pale, and he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror. "I saw her," he whispered. "Eleanor. She was standing right there by the window." No one else had seen anything, but the tension in the room was palpable. Merrick's fear was genuine, and despite Evelyn's attempt to remain rational, she could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, the team decided to sleep in shifts, but sleep was hard to come by. The house seemed to come alive in the darkness. The walls creaked as though they were breathing, and faint knocking sounds reverberated through the corridors. Twice, Jason thought he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, only to blink and find it gone. By the fifth night, everyone was exhausted, their nerves frayed. Dr. Merrick had become increasingly erratic, muttering about the symbols in the basement and the power they held. He insisted that the house was feeding off their fear, that it was more than just haunted, it was alive. Evelyn tried to reassure him, but deep down, she felt the house closing in on them. On the sixth night, everything came to a head. At precisely 3 a.m., the team was jolted awake by a deafening crash from the basement. Rushing downstairs, they found the door to the basement wide open, the lock twisted and broken, as though forced by an unseen hand. Against her better judgment, Evelyn led the group into the darkness below. The basement was colder than ever, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. As they descended the stairs, their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then they saw it. Etched into the stone floor was the same symbol Merrick had been obsessing over, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Before anyone could react, the temperature plummeted further, and the room was filled with a high-pitched screech, like metal being dragged across stone. Merrick collapsed, clutching his head, screaming in agony. His body convulsed as though something was trying to take hold of him. In the dim light, the team could see his eyes roll back into his head, his mouth forming words in a language none of them understood. Jason grabbed Merrick, trying to pull him to safety, but the basement door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. Trapped, Evelyn realized they were no longer dealing with a simple haunting. The house was alive, and it wanted something from them. In a desperate attempt to escape, Evelyn reached for her radio to call for help, but it was dead, just like every other piece of equipment. The house had cut them off from the outside world. As Merrick's screams grew louder, the shadows in the room began to shift, taking form. It was her, Eleanor. Her translucent figure stood in the corner, her face twisted with sorrow and rage. She raised a hand, and the room shook violently. The last thing Evelyn remembered before blacking out was the sound of Merrick's voice, now calm, repeating the words, "She's here. She's always been here." When Evelyn woke up, it was morning. The basement was empty, and the door was wide open. But Merrick was gone, just like Mark all those years ago. The rest of the team was unharmed but shaken to the core. They packed up their equipment and left Hill House, never to return. To this day, Evelyn refuses to speak about what happened in the basement. She abandoned her career in paranormal research, convinced that some places are better left undisturbed. Hill House still stands, waiting for the next group of skeptics to challenge its dark secrets. But those who know the truth understand that the house is not just haunted. It is cursed, and it will never let go of the souls it claims. And so, the legend of Hill House continues, a place where the living and the dead exist side by side, and where the past never truly rests in peace. The curse of Hill House, unleashed a decade had passed since Dr. Evelyn Clark's ill-fated expedition into Hill House, but the legend continued to grow. Despite her silence, rumors swirled about what had truly happened that night in the basement. Some believed Merrick had been consumed by the house, his soul trapped forever. Others whispered that the house had taken him as part of a dark ritual, fed by the energy of fear and death. In 2005, a new wave of attention fell on Hill House when a group of thrill-seeking college students, led by documentary filmmaker Daniel Pryor, decided to revisit the infamous mansion. Pryor had heard the stories, and like many before him, He didn't believe in ghosts. He saw Hill House as an opportunity to create the ultimate horror documentary, a modern twist on an old legend. His team consisted of 5 members: Sarah, his co-producer and childhood friend; Marcus, the tech expert; Claire, the group's skeptic; and Ryan, an experienced cameraman who had shot footage in abandoned and haunted locations across the country. They were all excited, nervous, and, most importantly, unaware of what truly awaited them. On the first night, they set up camp just outside the house, filming its imposing, decaying structure as the sun set. The weathered walls and boarded windows gave Hill House a timeless, eerie quality, as though it had been waiting for them all along. Pryor planned to spend 3 nights inside, capturing every moment and attempting to debunk the myths surrounding the house. The first night passed without incident. The group filmed interviews, discussed the house's history, and wandered the grounds. Pryor even read from an old diary they had found in the local library, written by a man who had lived in the house briefly in the early 1900s. His entries were filled with descriptions of strange noises and feelings of being watched, but Pryor dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind. But on the second night, things took a dark turn. The group had just finished setting up motion detectors and cameras around the house when the first sign of trouble emerged. Marcus was reviewing footage from one of the static cameras when he noticed something unusual. An empty hallway, filmed in complete silence, suddenly shifted. The camera shook, and for a brief moment, a shadow crossed the frame, just like Jason had seen all those years ago. It was subtle, but unmistakable. There was no one near that camera, and no explanation for the movement. Pryor, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as a technical glitch. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had grown uneasy since they'd stepped inside the house, feeling a presence she couldn't explain. That night, as the team huddled in the living room to review more footage, the air grew thick with tension. The old, broken grandfather clock in the corner, which hadn't worked in decades, began to tick faintly. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered, moving closer to inspect it. The ticking grew louder, faster, before suddenly stopping altogether. And then came the sound, a low, guttural whisper, so faint that at first they thought it was just the wind. But as it grew louder, it became unmistakable. Words they couldn't understand, muttered from somewhere in the shadows. The team froze. Pryor, trying to remain calm, asked Marcus to check the sound equipment. But before Marcus could move, the whispering stopped, and the room plunged into a heavy silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with a sudden creak, the basement door slowly swung open. A cold draft rushed out from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint smell of rot. Sarah grabbed Pryor's arm. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling, but Pryor, stubborn and determined to catch something on camera, shook his head. "No, this is what we came for. We're staying." Against their better judgment, the group followed Pryor into the basement. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the cold, damp darkness. The basement was as they expected, dusty, cluttered with old furniture, and covered in cobwebs. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. As they began to film, the whispering returned, this time louder and more distinct. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the house was speaking directly to them. Claire, the most vocal skeptic of the group, was the first to break. "This isn't right. We need to go, now." Pryor, still intent on capturing something extraordinary, ignored her pleas. He moved closer to the far corner of the basement, where the faint glow of the strange symbols Merrick had obsessed over was barely visible beneath the dust. The glowing symbols flickered for a moment, and then something moved. A shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, shifted across the room. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally slow. The group froze, watching in horror as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness like a nightmare come to life. Suddenly, the room was filled with an overwhelming pressure, as though the air had been sucked from their lungs. Sarah screamed as the shadow advanced, its face still hidden, but its presence undeniable. The cameras flickered, capturing the entity as it moved closer, but none of them dared to move. The shadow stopped just inches from Pryor, its face inches from his. For the first time, he realized the gravity of his mistake. The house wasn't just haunted by the ghost of Eleanor. It was a prison for something far darker, something ancient and malevolent that had been feeding on fear and suffering for over a century. Without warning, the shadow lunged. The basement was filled with chaos. The lights flickered violently, casting distorted shadows across the room. Marcus fell to the floor, gasping for breath, as if an invisible hand was choking him. Claire and Ryan scrambled toward the stairs, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Pryor, paralyzed with fear, stared in horror as the shadow twisted and writhed, its form shifting, growing more monstrous with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity vanished, leaving behind a deafening silence. The team fled, abandoning their equipment and running through the house in blind panic. When they finally reached the front door, it was open, as if the house had released them. They didn't stop until they were far from Hill House, the air outside feeling strangely warm in comparison to the cold, malevolent presence they had just escaped. Later, when they reviewed the footage, they found only static. Every camera had malfunctioned, save for one brief, chilling clip. Pryor's terrified face, illuminated by the faint glow of the symbols, and the shadow creeping toward him just before the screen went black. Hill House had claimed another victim, and Pryor would never speak of what he'd seen. The footage was enough to confirm what many already knew. Hill House was more than just haunted. It was a living nightmare, an ancient evil that could not be contained. And so, the house still stands, its secrets buried deep within its walls, waiting for the next group of souls foolish enough to cross its threshold. For those who do, one thing is certain: Hill House will never let them go.